So yeah, I'm Deputy Head of Sixth and Seven Coordinator here. Like I said, the importance of Oracy is sort of like being drummed into me, especially through EAS and sort of working in terms of my Seren role. But I've trained Voice 21, trained by Voice 21, and I've also been involved in a cluster Oracy program where we developed common Oracy strategies that we use amongst all the way from primary school into secondary school. So a bit of rationale for that. I looked at the Speak for Change Oracy All-Party Parliamentary Group Inquiry, and sort of looked at some of the summaries they came up with, and sort of linked it to our own setting. Obviously, LGS is 25% FSM, and vocabulary and oral communication are a deficit when they arrive to us, and that's something I think is so important for Oracy and communication is vocabulary deficit. And one of the things I picked out was that 30 million word gap between the wealthiest and the poorest in society. We are in our setting, a lot of these students, even if they don't fall into FSM categories, are going to fall into that category of poorest in society. So we are, we're doing them a disservice by not modeling that Oracy ourselves and showing them what they can do. Also, with the current language GCSE Oracy component, we've always done particularly well on that, and especially our individual Oracies, they've always been quite good. But what I do think that the language exam, it's one example that is an Oracy taught to accomplish an assessment task rather than to actually necessarily develop skills. They will develop certain skills, but I don't necessarily think they'll develop what we're trying to get out of this, which is to make them more effective communicators. And also writing and reading are very often prioritized in most settings due to like confidence issues, I suppose, with pupils, but also potentially with staff, because I think a lot of people can be quite uncomfortable with the chaos that comes from Oracy. And in our breakout room, we talked a little bit about that, how we can be a little bit unfamiliar with having the chaos in our classroom, especially if you keep a very tight rein on the class and you work in silence a lot of the time and so on. You can sort of, if it tips over that edge, sometimes it can be a little bit difficult to A, get it back, or to feel comfortable enough to pull it back when you need it. So I think some people can prioritize that writing and reading, and sometimes that can be the case across secondaries, but even in primaries, I've found. So the Voice 21 model for the strands of Oracy, you've got social, cognitive, linguistic, and physical. And what I've tried to do is link all of these aspects using TIThe, picking out some of the statements and talking a little bit about how they link effectively. So obviously social being engaging with people around you, cognitive being able to apply what you're saying, so the content, the structure, and so on. Linguistics are using adventurous vocabulary, rhetorical techniques, and so on. And then physical, like pace, tone, gestures, and so on. Physical, I feel like, is one of the most neglected things for us. I mean, we say to them, okay, make sure you're using gesticulations when you're talking. They don't know what that means. Pace yourself when you're talking, and they don't necessarily know what that means. And we sort of run into those barriers sometimes in individual Oracy where the entire speech is rushed. We say, speak for 5 to 7 minutes. They speak for 3.5 minutes, and then I'm struggling to ask them questions. So it's, I think physical is often neglected. It's something that we could potentially work on further. So in terms of social, I picked out the areas such as listening to understand, listening with empathy and respect, collaborative talk, and there's a whole range of collaborative talk ideas that are all the way through, especially looking on TIThe. And that's something that definitely links to Voice 21, hence why I think some of their strategies are so important for developing the new curriculum Oracy and the new approach to Oracy. So what I picked out from that as well is a quote from Stephen Covey, which is, most people do not listen with the intent to understand, they listen with the intent to reply. So looking at that social aspect about guiding interactions, turn talk taking, self-assurance and audience awareness, most of our learners, especially in a group setting, are just listening just so they can go, yeah, but my point is, or they're jumping in before the other person's finished speaking, before they've even absorbed their point, or even looked at their point. And then it becomes a little bit difficult to deal with. So as I was saying in the group Oracy, I've filmed Oracies before where they have just stayed silent. They've seen what somebody else is saying. They've responded, but they've picked up nothing at all of what the other person said. There's no element of active listening that allows them to respond properly in a group conversation. And one thing they always hammer home in the Unit 1 is it needs to be organic. And it's something when EAS visited with Jane Crawley-Adams a little while ago and looked at our Oracy samples, they said that it needs to be organic, and the best ones will always be organic. But then how do you accomplish that organic nature to a group oracy if they don't actively listen? So something that I picked up on a brilliant inset day, and I know people don't really put brilliant and inset day together, but this one was actually a brilliant inset day, of what type of contributor are you? So we've got openers, navigators, derailers, and blockers. So what I've done in sort of year 7 classes especially, and moving further through the school, I will often give somebody a clipboard, because I love a clipboard, it makes them feel really official. I give them a clipboard, and I say, you're going to circulate now, you're going to go around all of these groups as their group oracy is going on, and you're going to write down for me who you think the opener is, who you think the navigator is, who you think the derailer is, and who you think the blocker is. Now, the students can be a lot harsher than I am. So when they go around, they'll be like, oh, blocker, and then immediately write their name down, you know, as if it's some kind of terrible thing. But what I found is that sort of like trial by social aspect works quite well for oracy, because if someone else calls them out and says, well, you're being a bit of a blocker here, you're sort of like stopping people from speaking, it's a little bit easier than if it comes from me sometimes. And I also think this helps develop those group oracy strategies by identifying who's opening the discussions well, and perhaps changing their role to being more of a navigator. And contrary to what you might expect, when I give people the clipboards to go around and do their sort of oracy, I suppose, chaperoning, I always pick the strongest speakers in the class, because I know they are already very, very good at oracy, which means when they look around and they see other people doing certain things, like being an opener, navigator, derailer, or blocker, they can point it out and they can recognize it far better than somebody else who may not be able to. And it also gives those a little bit more of a chance in the class who aren't really very confident speakers. And I feel it works quite well in the classroom for that. Obviously, there are some settings you're not going to be able to do that. And there are people that are going to absolutely abuse the system. But I think introducing it as early as possible means that they are much more familiar with dealing with group discussion and also facing that critique from oracy. Because I think of one of the biggest anxieties amongst this current generation is that they're afraid of looking like an idiot. And something we talked about in our breakout room is they have, when they get a text from somebody, they have minutes, hours to formulate their response and actually create some kind of discussion from it. They don't have that long in person, and that can send anxiety through the roof, rightly or wrongly. So then talking about cognitive, so like actually applying what you're saying, like the content, the structure, clarifying self-regulation and reasoning. Something that we put a lot of onus on, I suppose, in the individual discussion when we look at the effective communication and we look at how are you structuring your response? Does it fit the audience? Does it fit the purpose, and so on? So what I've done in the past is use the formality scale, which I think is quite fun, where we've got different aspects of English, and we talk about tone, and we talk about how you speak, and we put it on the informality scale. Now I've got this so informal, and I know you're all going to chew my head off by using 3 O's instead of the standard 1, but I think it's important to show that it is very informal to do something like that. And then you've got the frightfully formal, like how formal do you actually need to be? I've used this with writing tasks. I've used this to promote oracy and develop that into a writing task. And they find it quite fun to sort of categorize different aspects of speech and tell and sort of inform me, is this informal? Is this frightfully formal? I always make a big point as well of going over slang being the absolute epitome of super informal. They can't use it at all, and they think, oh, it's just informality. Slang is so far past informality that they shouldn't be using it at all unless it's for a specific purpose. So I've used that in the past, and that's been quite good to getting them to think about, how should I be speaking? What should I be using? So that links quite nicely onto linguistic. So the use of vocabulary, language, rhetorical techniques, and this is something we harp on about. Some people still use things like deforest and so on, and developing those kind of areas. I'm sort of against that. I think it needs to be taught slightly differently, but I think it can still work. So what I've got for you here is a QR code, and I'm thinking linguistically, if I'm trying to develop their linguistic skills and getting them to speak, I need to model that myself. I can't just expect them to, respond well to my written feedback if I've given them an oracy task. So you are welcome. If you want to have a look at that, you can scan it with your phone. It's still there. I use Vocaroo, and I picked this up from a primary school because I didn't think Vocaroo would be something I would be interested in. Someone mentioned it, and I was like, oh, really? Vocaroo sounds a bit silly. I use it all the time. It's absolutely brilliant, and it can generate a QR code for that Oracy bit really quickly. It does it instantaneously after you've recorded it. It's short form recording. So what I do is I'll create all of these, stick them in their books, and then when they come in, they can scan it and see all feedback from me. So rather than me just writing it, I've modeled the Oracy. So if they've got something particularly wrong or they've not phrased themselves correctly, I may rephrase what they said. So when I'm doing my initial notes, I might make a note of something explicit that they said, and then I will rephrase it and say, you could have said, and done it like that. That way, I hope that it gets through to them a little bit better than me just writing it down. Oh, you could have said this instead. I think using Vocaroo is instantaneous and quick. You can do it on your phone. You can use the, I just use my webcam microphone on the computer and generate them really quickly. And this one was one that I did a little while ago for Year 9 people. So yeah, I really love Vocaroo, and I think it helps model that linguistic aspect I was saying, modeling that vocabulary, using language correctly. That is so important. And we can't just rely on writing our feedback for Oracy, it needs to be verbal. So then that leads me on to physical. So the use of pace, tone, gestures, posture, facial expressions, eye contact. And that links to clarity and vocabulary. So being clear, using the correct pace, using the correct tone per audience. And we say with Unit 1 Oracy, when they're giving an individual presentation, they have to be using formal language. They have to be speaking as if they're speaking to their peers. But sometimes that can be really difficult. And choosing the right tone, choosing the right pace to develop them can be a challenge. So someone spoke about emojis earlier, and I've used this lower down the school with choose an emoji. The emoji will indicate the tone that you're speaking will adopt. And it works quite well for the lower school, like 7 and 8, because they'll pick one and then they'll just sort of have a bit of usually have a bit of sass to them. Like if you look at the first emoji, you know, they'll be like, oh my God, you know, they'll change their tone when they're speaking, and it will hopefully show that tone really does make a massive difference as to how people receive what you say. And again, this can link back to texting. It's so difficult to see when you're typing to somebody, their tone and how they're saying something. Our current Year 7 and 8 find full stops terrifying, because when somebody texts them and puts a full stop at the end, that means they're angry. Like, where does that come from? It's something that's sort of evolved and we've sort of created. And that translates to tone. The way that you speak obviously influences the people around you. And in this case, by showing them that you're adapting your tone and somebody can recognize that tone when you're speaking to us, that's the kind of tone that we expect to hear from you. We expect certain kinds of ways of speaking to certain people. And I've done it in terms of almost behavioral as well. Like, how is your tone when you're speaking to teachers? How is your tone when you're speaking to your peers? And using that kind of a bit of a silly kind of task, but it works, and it helps develop their pace and their tone and how they speak, and, you know, their emotional state when they do speak. I've also done active verb. This one is a bit of the drama teacher within me coming out, but I did a Dulce et Decorum Est, and I got them all up on their feet, and I said, right, I'm going to put a verb on the board. They will have never seen this verb before, quite often, like trudging or floundering. However, when I said the verb, a lot of them got it right from acting it and actually producing something. So with trudging, they'd sort of like trudge really slowly. With floundering, they'd wave their arms about. And it helps them sort of define something in a physical manner, and it's physical oracy that helped develop that. So I said, okay, now you've done that action, can you define that word for me? And most of the time they were getting it right, because they had that opportunity to show rather than, you know, just write and try and define and work out the words via, you know, traditional methods. By having that active verb, it's a bit drama, but it works, and it can help with their physical oracy, not just necessarily speaking, but their actions and the way they present themselves. So as I was saying, like, traditional methods of oracy feedback can work. Like, I use this kind of sheet myself, so I've got some of the I can statements, and then they color code them with their highlighters, and then I QA it. So it can work, and I feel like some tasks it lends itself well to that. But as I was saying earlier, pushing the verbal feedback when you're doing an oracy task means it's like I do, you do. Like like when I was taught in PGC, it was like, you know, if you're not willing to do the same thing you're telling the kids to do, like, what's the point? Because, you know, you're not modeling the correct usage of it. So being verbal, I think, is so important when giving feedback. So you've probably all seen this one before, which is the Voice 21 groupings. I'm not going to harp on because as we've said, a lot of people are using Voice 21, so it's expected. Obviously, I cherry pick when it comes to Voice 21, like Nest. There's no way I'm ever going to use Nest with a Year 11 class. Can you imagine me telling my Year 11 class to go off into each corner of the room and just whisper to themselves quietly? It doesn't actually develop anything in terms of this setting. Works quite well for primary school, but I think Nest doesn't really work for our setting. Some of the other ones work quite well. Onion works really well. If you've got a resilient group, because they sort of watch each other speak. And especially with Coaching Onion, they watch each other speak, which can be really demoralizing, especially for some pupils who can't really face our criticism, let alone the criticism from their peers. But if you've got a resilient group, Coaching Onion is great. Having a central group where they're all discussing a topic and then people around the outside either watching individual people or the group dynamic is such valuable feedback, because as a teacher, we've got one set of eyes, one set of ears. We can't hear everything. We can't pick up on everything, especially in a 7 to 10 minute group discussion. So having that Coaching Onion and having them watch each other is such valuable feedback. They'll pick up on things that I wouldn't pick up on. And they're also very harsh in comparison to me when it comes to Oracy, but sometimes they need to hear that to develop further. And the same way with the talking roles, I had these talking roles developed into little cue cards. So they've got like a little ring binder through them, and the students, when I do Oracy tasks, I'll sometimes give these out. So they have to take on a different role to what they'd normally do. So for example, if they're usually a challenger and they're constantly challenging what other people are saying, I'll challenge them. This time you've got to be a builder. You've got to build somebody else's discussion instead of challenge it. Or, right, you always summarize the discussion at the end. I instead want you to be a clarifier today. You're going to ask all the questions. So I've used the talking roles in quite a useful way, I think. And I've also used the LGS discussion placemat, and I've got the mantra underneath, build your discussion, don't stop it, because I think it's so important that they keep building and they keep using these different sentence stems to develop their conversation, and especially something that is often neglected, which is idioms. And sort of like when we talk, we use idioms all the time, and it's something that shows good linguistic mastery, I think, to use idioms. It shows you're a natural when it comes to it. Sort of like just to finish off is to go into a couple of strategies that we looked at when it came to the cluster Oracy. And I mentioned it briefly at the beginning, which was we got together with the primary schools, we sat down and we developed different Oracy strategies that are going to be used across the curriculum and used in a primary setting so they know them by the time they come up to us. Now, I held out my hopes for this because I was thinking, oh my God, this would be so good if it actually worked. So we developed about 3 or 4 different strategies, and some of which I'm using consistently. And what I'm pleased to share that since we introduced it about 4 or 5 years ago now, the primary school students that are coming up recognize the techniques. And that has been so useful for us to see the primary schools doing it and then how it translates to us and using these techniques. So first one is popcorn. You've probably seen this one before. It's for whole class feedback. You can show like an image or some kind of stimulus to the class. They've got a minute to think of a word that relates to the stimulus. So it could be a word they're going to use for a vocabulary bank or something like that. Once they have their word, they stand up, and then I say 1, 2, 3, popcorn. As soon as I say popcorn, they say their word repeatedly in a normal speaking voice. Now you can imagine the absolute carnage that will come from this if you just let everyone shout over each other. So what I've done before, if it's a particularly difficult class, I'll do it in groups. So I'll say that table are going to stand up first, that table are going to sit down next, and so on. Every time I hear a word, I put it up on the board. And essentially within maybe 5 minutes, I've got an entire word bank on the board. If somebody else has said their word already, they can sit down, or if they've got a different word, they can keep saying it over and over again. As soon as I've written it on the board, it's there. It's incredibly quick at developing a word bank for a writing task. It gives very quick oral feedback if you want to use it that way. And again, they become popped popcorn when they sit down. I know the drama teacher within me can't resist, but they sit down and they develop sort of, and hopefully that word bank will allow them to develop their ideas further. So like I said, creation of a word bank and whole class feedback post discussion can work for popcorn. I've used it in P4C as well. So when I've done a P4C activity with them, I'll then popcorn at the end to see their thoughts and feelings and make sort of like a word cloud. And that works quite well to sort of sum everything up. So I did that with this. I had an incredibly low ability 7 class this year that I wanted to try a few things out on. They were their reading ages are pretty much like 80% of the class, I think, was below reading age 10. So they were struggling in general, and I wanted to sort of develop their Oracy skills as I was talking about, the reading skills. So we did a bit of reading. Then they had to develop that into a writing task, which was to create a description of a rat or many rats in the town of Hamlin, because we were doing fairy tales. So then we started using some of the SPOs from the Writing Revolution, and I was going to develop that into my lesson. And I got them to popcorn what a rat looks like and what a rat acts like. And their vocabulary that came from that, they took things out of the text we were looking at. So one girl stood up and said, gnawing. And I was like, oh, gnawing, what a brilliant word to use. And that's something that I probably never would have got out of her before, but she was quite happy to stand up in front of everyone and show, yeah, I know a word. And it helped develop that confidence that she was able to come and tell me what this word was. And I wrote it up on the board, and everyone used it in their single paragraph outlines. So I think the Oracy, to develop that writing task from a reading task in a way, sort of kept the trinity going. We had all three in one lesson. So I think that works quite well. Now, fish and chips, contentious one for me. I like fish and chips as a meal, but also as like a strategy. I sometimes with my higher ability classes or my older year groups call it ones and twos, because when I say fish and chips, they're sort of like, oh my God, so childish. But you know, it works. Now, this is just paired work. There's nothing special about fish and chips being paired work, but the only change is that you would say something like, okay, fish talk to fish, chips talk to chips, fish talk to chips. You're changing the group dynamic of talking together. So rather than just say turn and talk to your partner, okay, fish talk about X, chips talk about Y. You can change the way that the group dynamic is, and you can make people turn and talk to each other rather than just talk to the person next to you. So I find that quite useful when it comes to like full group organization, role discussion, collaboration, because I can get them to speak to people that they never speak to, and it works quite well. And then the last one I'll talk about is trios, which is in the Voice 21 strategy. So it's something that you've probably done before. But trios is where two students speak and one member of the group, this is three in total, one member of the group is a silent summarizer. And at the end, they're the ones that give me the feedback. I find this works so well with confident speakers because I make the confident speakers the ones who are, what do you call it? I make the confident speakers the ones who are the silent summarizers. So they instead are going to feed back to me at the end and give the other people a little bit of a chance to get going and get started. And I find that trios works much better in any setting that you would use a paired work for. But it's about the confidence and the classroom dynamic to try it out. So if you're going to try anything from the session and completely ignore the rest of the stuff I've said, please try trios. It's really good. And I think that it works so effectively in a classroom setting for anyone who is lacking confidence with Oracy, but also who is overconfident with Oracy and needs a little bit of reining in and sort of to just sit silently and actively listen to the other people. It's the best strategy for encouraging active listening, in my opinion. And I'll just leave off really cheese with talk is the most powerful tool of communication in the classroom and is fundamental